Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Liddon. It's my pleasure to be hosting this Andrews Pre-Election Roundtable, and I should say a very special welcome to those of you who are watching this online. Thank you for taking the trouble to register and log in. May you, for at least the next 45 minutes, may your Wi-Fi signal be strong and all your pixels are clear. Well, housing, property, mortgages, generation, rent, they're right at the top of the political agenda, and we're going to see if we can thrash out some ideas here on where we're going in the housing and rental market post the election, and even in the run up to it now, only a couple of weeks away. And I've got some experts here who I hope will absolutely nail some of the questions we've had in. Let me begin by introducing them. We start with Michael Robson, who's the Chief Executive of Andrews, one of the largest independent estate agents. He's a Fellow of the National Association of Estate Agents, a Director of the Property Ombudsman, and he's been in the property industry for over 35 years, as has the man sitting next to him, Stephen Smith, a Director at Legal & General. He runs L&G's mortgage distribution operation, the Mortgage Club, which does around 1 in 5 new mortgages in the UK, and Stephen is also on the board of L&G's surveying company and network company. Next we have Tom Lacey, who's a tax manager with Moore Blatch's Tax and Trust team, specialising in personal tax, capital gains tax, IHT and the taxation of trusts. He advises on international tax issues for both resident and non-resident individuals, including non-DOMs living in the UK. Perhaps that will be leaving the UK, depending who wins the next election. Next we have Andy Tilsley, who's the Regional Sales Manager at Nationwide. He played an integral role in both general insurance product expansion within the agency network and the Business Development Manager pilot. Andy now leads a team of 8 business development managers responsible for delivery of both Nationwide and the Mortgage Works targets. And last, but by no means least, Mike Day, who's Director of Development and Home Ownership at the Nightstone Housing Association. He's also Managing Director of Arc Development Southwest Limited, their commercial housing subsidiary company. He's responsible for the development of their new homes, sales and marketing of shared ownership and outright sale homes, and for the leasehold management team. Our panel. Let's begin by asking, does the fact we now have fixed-term general elections, we've known there's going to be an election coming up, has that had any impact on the property market? Michael, let's begin with you.
Well, I think experience and research shows, Richard, that an election has a small effect on the market. It's because it introduces some uncertainty, confidence levels fall a little bit, and therefore the market slows down. So we're seeing that, but I don't think it will have a long-term effect. And research and experience suggests that if the same parties returned, the market recovers very quickly. If it's a new government, then it may well be it take a little bit longer, but I don't think it will hold back the market for the rest of the year.
Andy, what's the view from Nationwide?
Well, if I just go back and look at some of the previous 4 or 5 general elections, there seems to be a bit of a trend. And around about sort of 6 months before the general election, there's a bit of a peak, and then we go into a lull. And there is argument to say actually the first January, February, March of this year, we've had a quieter period.
Prices dropped, didn't they, in your survey, in February, for example?
They've actually, they've gone up slightly. But then post the general election, that pent-up demand then comes through. And that's been fairly evident over the last sort of 4 or 5 general elections.
Stephen, have you seen any evidence that knowing there's a general election has spooked the market, quieted it down, sped it up?
Well, the first quarter of this year started very well on the mortgage broking side, the mortgage lending side. I don't see why many people going about their ordinary lives would be affected. People move home because of family change, family size change, because of perhaps falling out with neighbours or needing to move because of job relocation. Those things aren't necessarily affected by an election. I think things that could make a big pause, though, are things like the referendum. Certainly the Scottish experience last year showed the property market slowing dramatically in the run-up to the referendum and then picking up again afterwards. And I'd have to say I would be concerned if we actually go into a Euro referendum as to the overall impact on the UK property market then.
Tom, have you noticed any impact at all?
No, volumes are holding up quite well. It doesn't seem to be any changes in sort of interest rates on the horizon, which is key driver to buy or not to buy, or to stick with your current mortgage. So it all seems to be pretty calm at the moment, no panics.
And I'm guessing with you, Mike, that from the politics point of view, from a housing association point of view, there's probably not too much impact?
Not so much, too much impact, because the current government have actually committed funding through from 2015 through to 2020, so that's actually helped that in quite a way. But there's still a certain amount of uncertainty, which no doubt we'll come on to, about certain policies in the manifesto, which may have quite a big impact on our sector. So there is always worry about changes in housing policy and the impact that that will have on us.
Indeed, and we will come to look at that in just a moment. Now, all the parties are talking about affordable housing as a priority. How realistic is that, Michael?
Well, it's the goal of all politicians, isn't it, to encourage the electors that houses will become more affordable under them. I think there are several plans which may make some housing more affordable. I mean, certainly Help to Buy has helped developers. I believe some developers are reporting that 50% of their deals, up to 50%, are funded by Help to Buy. Each party has come forward with a different approach to how they might make housing more affordable. But you know, the underlying factor is that we're just not building enough houses. We're not building enough houses whether you want to rent them or buy them. And if there's insufficient supply, house prices are going to be forced up. So affordability, I think, is a questionable term. But there are one or two ideas that might help.
Stephen, Help to Buy so far has helped around 83,000. The Tories are talking about extending it for another 5 years. It's a drop in the ocean, isn't it?
Well, it's not. It is a bit of a drop in the ocean. My main concern would be that it's a supply, it's a demand-side stimulus, and until you get the supply side sorted out, as Michael quite rightly says, we don't build enough houses in the UK, and we haven't done for a decade or more. Until we get the demand side sorted out, the supply side sorted out, extra demand is simply going to force prices upwards.
The parties have all promised building, Labour and the Tories 200,000 a year, the Lib Dems I think 300,000 a year. Do you believe them, Andy?
Well, if you actually look at the past record, just go back the last sort of 10, 15 years, very rarely have we actually gone above 200,000. So quoting 300,000 is fine, that's a pledge, but delivering is another thing.
Why is that? Why haven't, given those demand, this must be the only market where people aren't struggling to meet a demand?
It's an interesting one, because if you look at the household formation, it far outweighs the building construction. And there's certainly the land there, but the question you've got is, have we got a skill shortage? Do we have a material shortage? And we have to get these numbers up quickly, and we're unlikely to be able to do that.
You're actually saying we don't have enough builders? Is that what you're saying?
Skill shortage, yes.
Really? Tom, is that something that you agree with?
Yes, I certainly would do. I mean, just in the where I work in Lymington, several houses are large, substantial houses being built, but they're being using prefab construction techniques rather than more traditional building strategies.
And is there anything that you see from any of the parties that's likely to deliver the volume that we need to produce affordable housing?
No, again, if you look at the UK house construction over the last 30, 40 years, and you look at the private sector, that is pretty much levelled out around about 170, 180,000. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, where we were delivering 300,000 plus, you had the local authorities involved. We don't have that now, so we've lost that potential.
And good news for private landlords who are sitting pretty as ever.
Absolutely, but I think there's another fundamental difference in the market. In the old days, as it were, when we were building those sort of more substantial numbers, there were lots more SME builders, small and medium-sized enterprise builders. Those seem to have been driven out of the market in the last 10 or 15 years by the state of the economy and the market downturn. And until we get them back, until we can encourage people to build 10, 15 houses in a local village or a local town again, I think we'll struggle to get up to those numbers.
Mentioning that, of course, brings up the issue of planning, because plenty of people talk about, oh yes, it'd be great to have affordable housing, as long as it's not next door to me. We've got an example of that literally a mile away from where we're seated tonight. Is planning an issue, Michael?
Absolutely. I mean, the planning system is locked. The green belt, the concept of green belt has been completely overtaken. Green belt was meant to protect some of our most valuable forests and our most valuable parkland and national parks. It wasn't meant to protect every single piece of green field, scrappy or small, around every single village or town in the United Kingdom. But because of NIMBYism really, we have reinvented the purpose of Greenbelt, and unpopular though it is, the fact is we're going to have to release some of this Greenbelt. Brown land is not going to supply enough land to meet housing needs.
So if
it's
you
a
could,
very, very intractable question.
If you could wave a magic wand in front of whoever's housing minister post the election with regard to planning, what would you do?
I think Stephen touched on it then actually. I think it would be allowed every farmer and every small village to build 15 houses. I think if they were allowed to do that, and if some of them were affordable, that would be a massive solution. I can understand why nobody wants the development of 200 houses on their doorstep. But actually, we don't need to do that. We just need to allow communities to build a small number of houses. But of course, that's deeply unpopular to the large developers.
And Mike, of course, affordable housing from a housing association point of view means more people are looking to the likes of you, and yet you've had a bit of a bombshell with what the Conservatives announced.
They certainly did. It was one of the darkest days of my life, I think, last week when they announced in their manifesto.
Did you have any idea that was coming?
There was some inkling that it was being mooted, but it was still quite a shock, really.
But just explain in brief what it actually means for the likes of you in housing associations.
Well, it means a huge amount, really, because we borrow a huge amount of private finance and link that with public finance. So it has implications for our ability to raise private finance in the future. We don't believe any of the rhetoric about being able to replace right to buy homes on a like-for-like basis. We think the funding for that, which is going to be, I understand, through the sale of high-value council homes, that just seems to be flawed, and why not use that income to build more houses to actually increase the supply. And some of our, it's such a precious resource, affordable housing, and a lot is in places like, we've got quite a lot in central Bath, in rural areas, and the impact of right to buy has big effects on the economy of those sort of areas, because obviously it means that those people who need affordable housing in those areas effectively, once the properties are sold, they're lost to the sector forever. And an interesting stat is about 30% of right to buy properties actually end up as buy to rent let for investors. So that's lost forever, all of that subsidy. And I personally think it's unfair. Why should somebody who's already living in good quality, subsidised housing on a low rent, then have the benefit of up to £100,000 discount to buy that property, when there are people perhaps in equal need in the private sector who will not have that right to buy? It just does not seem equitable, and that precious resource of affordable housing will be lost forever and not replaced. So a dark day, and I just hope it doesn't happen.
Well, I noticed a lot of nodding of heads from your private sector colleagues here, who I thought were capitalists red in tooth and claw. You actually share this view that it would be wrong to sell off at a discount housing association properties.
I completely share that view. I find it extraordinary that, the government doesn't own housing association properties, so for them to put them up for sale at a discount seems a bit of a giant leap in itself. But the association movement's been doing such a good job. It's taken up the slack where it was needed to provide affordable social rented accommodation in the country. We still have massive waiting lists, and to give it a body blow like that just seems to be a very, very strange policy, I have to say.
So do any of you have any faith that any of the parties will come anywhere near to solving the fact that simply we aren't building enough houses? Do any of you believe that any of them will get anywhere near the targets that we need?
No, and I think the point's already been raised. It's a real capacity issue to be able to build housing in this country. We had to complete a large programme of houses for the end of March, and we had awful problems getting good labour to site, materials, and contractors are struggling. There's about 1 million people, I understand, have left the industry since the recession, and we're just not training enough people. So even if there was, a party who was very committed, there was funding available, I think we just haven't got the capacity. And the average age, I think, of the construction industry now is in the sort of mid-40s. And we need to think radically as to how we can actually build again. And that might be through off-site manufacturing or whatever, but we need to think radically, because we just haven't got the capacity in this country to build the number of houses we need.
We had the supposed influx of Polish plumbers, but we need brickies, we need chippies, we need
all trades right across
and
the
materials.
board. And materials, yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people watching this will think it's absolutely extraordinary that we haven't got people who can build houses or provide
But the other problem, Richard, is it's not only the number of houses. What we all know, it's where they're built. There is a demand for a certain sort of housing, and the demand is very high in the southwest, the southeast, and London. And it's how do you meet that demand? Yeah. And I don't believe that any political party has got a solution to that one.
And whatever you come up with, it isn't going to be a quick fix solution either.
But perhaps what Michael's just said puts the spotlight on the point. No political party can do this. There's a strong argument, I would say, for depoliticising housing. It's too big an issue for the country to leave to the politicians. You're going to have stop-start policies, and where it takes 3 years from a plot of land to a completed house, if you take planning as well as building, stop-start policies are the last thing you need. So one of our colleagues in the mortgage lending industry suggested last week that housing policy ought to be taken out of the hands of government and given to, say, the Bank of England, and that it ought to be run on a long term. It ought to have a 15-year plan, not even a 5-year plan. I appreciate the HCA 5-year plan is quite a good idea, but a 15-year plan would give builders the confidence to recruit apprentices. It would give people a confidence to enter into an industry, rather than thinking I might do 3 years bricklaying and then there's going to be the next downturn.
Well, you paint a pretty bleak picture, all of you, but it's hard to believe, given, say, with record low interest rates and every indication that they're likely to continue. About a year ago, we were talking about interest rates beginning to edge up, and would that take the edge off inflation? Now we're talking about them staying historically low for a lot longer. I mean, if you can't build now, when on earth will we? Tom?
Well, it's, as I think my other panel members have sort of dealt with the issue, it's one of capacity. First of all, on the supply side, actual land, okay, we can release that for development, but it's actually then getting the people then in to actually build it. And as Stephen said, it'll take 10 to 15 years to get the trainees and apprentices through to actually constructing things. It's not something you can switch on and off. It's something that needs slowly building up over time.
And you mentioned interest rates. Again, if you map out interest rates over a period of time, there is no correlation between interest rates and new build construction.
No.
So it's the capacity that's the issue, not the interest rate.
I'm thinking the median deposit in the UK is now 30,000, 70,000 in London. I mean, affordable housing it remains a pipe dream of what you're saying. It's going to be for at least the next 5-10 years.
I think it's where some imagination's needed, and again, the Housing Association sector leads on this. We did some work with Shelter, the housing charity, a couple of years ago about intermediate tenures, so shared ownership. Because in large parts of the UK, the average income for a family will not buy will not be able to buy the average property. And literally that's something like 90% of the UK. The only answer, there's two answers I suppose, is high loan-to-value mortgages and Bank of Mum and Dad subsidising about half of first-time buyers. But the real answer is actually to put a lot more imagination into shared ownership and a lot more government money, local authority money into shared ownership initiatives through the Housing Association movement.
I would certainly agree with that. I mean, we've got about 1,500 shared ownership homes, and I think sort of the average income for a shared ownership home in sort of our neck of the woods, Bristol, South Somerset, is around about sort of 25,000-30,000 sort of income, which is, that is affordable for a large number of people. And I think shared ownership needs to be simplified. It's quite a complex product, and there's lots of different variations. But I do see that shared ownership is a panacea for meeting a lot of housing need in this country if it was properly streamlined as a product and properly marketed.
I want to move on to a specific question which we've had in, and that is how, I suppose, pension freedom, which came into force this April, what effect that's had on the market. I know it's early days, and in particular, our question wanted to know, especially buy-to-let. Clearly, there are going to be a lot of people of a certain age, that might include some of us here, who might be thinking, you know what, I'm going to take that money out, I'm going to go to buy-to-let. I'm the only person in the street who doesn't rent property these days. Is there any sign that that's happening? Michael?
I think it's too early, to be honest. I think that we haven't seen that yet. I think we've also got to bear in mind, am I right, that the statistics the other day was that the average pension pot was £32,000, was that right? So £32,000 isn't going to help many people with the affordability question buy a property. Our belief is that it will make some difference. We believe some wealthier pensioners will come into the buy-to-let market, but they would also need to take good advice because it is a long-term and illiquid investment.
Right.
So I don't think it's for everybody. It is a long-term decision.
I think that that point about the average size of the pension pot is fundamental to this. I don't see a wall of money hitting the buy-to-let market. And frankly, you know, for an individual to put their pension into one individual property is probably not sound advice anyway. If you're able to finance several, if you had a portfolio, or if there's somewhere you could invest in property and share that risk, that might be a better approach. But you know, if I had £30,000 and that was my nest egg, I don't think I'd bank it all on one property and let it out to students or whatever.
And Tom, is buy-to-let something you're still recommending your wealthy clients?
Some are still very much going for it, particularly those with larger portfolios. I think one of the key points in moving out, say, from pension, taking money out and putting it in a buy-to-let, is you're going from a tax-free environment in the pension, it's growing tax-free, into an environment, once you get a buy-to-let, you're exposed to a whole raft of taxes, which is good news for the Chancellor. You've got SDLT on purchase, you've got income tax if you make a rental profit, and if you sell at a profit, you've got capital gains tax. So the Chancellor would like you to take your money out and buy a buy-to-let, please.
Do you anticipate anything, Andy? Do you think it's going to have an impact?
It's interesting that a number of estate agents have reported increased inquiries, but that tends to be more around clarification of the pension rules and what they're entitled to and what they're not. When they find out actually the size of the pot that they've got and what impact it could have, we are seeing signs of those inquiries turning around to other forms of deposits for buy-to-lets. So in other words, how can I use my residential as a means of leveraging a deposit, if that's something I'm seriously looking to get into.
Let's move from one end of the age spectrum, the pension pot one, to the generation rent, as they know it. And I've got a daughter who's in London, who's part of that, and I look at my 3 children and think, you know what, guys, despite everything that the bank of mum and dad can do, I can't honestly see how you're ever going to be able to afford your own home. Is there a generation rent, and is that it? Is that set in stone? That's just a fact of life, something which we in the UK aren't really used to. It's more common in Europe, for example. And is it a bad thing?
I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that we also have to look at the bigger factors, that students coming out with larger student debt that they have to repay. Figures of 30 to 40,000 now aren't unusual, so that changes the affordability for them buying houses. The second fact is that they have far more mobility in jobs. They're tending to start their careers later. So all these are a factor. So I don't think it's a bad thing that we've got a larger number of people in the private rented sector. And neither do I think actually it's an entirely negative picture for them going forward. I think more of them will come into the home ownership sector. Home ownership peaked at something like 68%. Under Margaret Thatcher, it's now fallen back slowly to around just over 60%, 61 or 62%. So it's still enormously popular. I believe surveys that ask renters would they like to own a property still come back with a resounding positive that they would. So I don't think all that's lost. It's tougher, but I do think that more people will find a way of buying a home than we possibly think, just later in life.
Andy, do you feel sorry when you have kids coming in their 20s and 30s that are living with mum and dad and struggling hard to try to deposit that or even be able to afford a mortgage?
I think lenders do have a sense of responsibility in terms of trying to support whatever government initiatives are out there. And I think something like the Help to Buy schemes, where you quite rightly said that over 80,000 people have benefited from that. But lenders, I think, can do more. And certainly if you look over the last sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, increasing loan to values is a classic point. More innovation in terms of how you help these people that are in a very challenging situation.
I suppose the danger of a loan to value, we're talking about 95% in some cases now. We get back to the Balliol days, which some people say precipitated that whole mess in the first place. Hasn't the sort of new rules on mortgage applications tighten that up?
They have. Since MMR was introduced in April 14, lenders are constrained by making the decisions based on affordability. And I think that's the right thing to do. So long gone the days where someone would come in and say, can I just have 6 times my income? And that was it. No, you'll find that most lenders have credit scorecards, they'll have algorithms behind to make sure that the people that are applying for the mortgage can actually afford it. And built within those models are stress levels whereby we increase the interest rates as well.
What's the age profile within housing associations?
We house people of all ages, to be honest, but predominantly young people under 40, certainly in our properties, and then we've got quite a big stock of elderly persons accommodation. So I would guess probably under 40 and over 65 really would be predominantly.
Are they with you and happy, or are they frustrated owners? What's the score on it, or do they just accept that this is something that?
I mean, we do have very high satisfaction rates from people living in our houses, but I think many would aspire to home ownership at some stage. But for many, it's just totally out of their reach, really, and will always be so.
I suppose, given that aspiration and given what we were saying earlier, and you all assented to it, you can understand from why the Conservative Party would say, well, actually, you've just nailed it on the head. Why shouldn't somebody be able to buy and own their property?
Well, I would encourage them to buy a new property or another property somewhere else, so that they move from their existing home, which is a precious resource, and that can then be re-let. I think that yes, they should have that aspiration and be able to aspire to ownership, but perhaps through shared ownership or other initiatives in a new house or other property. So supply is increased, and social housing, affordable housing remains as affordable housing for the next generation.
There used to be a scheme some years ago where tenants were given a deposit to free up the house and use that deposit towards buying a home. Wouldn't that be a better solution?
That would be a great idea, actually, Michael. Yeah, very good idea. Yes, there was. It was a very small initiative, very little money, but yeah, I think it has the seeds of a very good idea.
Labour is talking about banning what they call rip-off letting fees. Currently around £600. How's that going to affect the market? How's that going to affect you?
Yes. Well, this is a highly emotional subject, and this is one which has been driven by Citizens Advice and Shelter, who've both had a lot to say about it. And it's absolutely true, Richard, that I think there are a small number of estate agents, letting agents in Britain that have a lot to answer for very, very poor practice. But what we must just simply look at is this, that there is work to do when you rent a property. There's a check-in fee, there's a referencing fee, keys have to be cut, referencing has to be done, and someone's going to pay for that work. So whether that's works paid for by the tenant, which we call tenants' fees, or whether this is paid for by the landlord, somebody's going to pay for the work. Now, as you know, in Scotland they've banned fees to tenants. All that has resulted in doing is that the cost of that work has been transferred to the landlord, and in return the landlord has increased the rent to cover the increased costs. The bad news to the tenant is that the tenant now pays that increased rent in perpetuity, or at least for the length of the lease, and all that is doing is forcing up rent. So sadly, the only net winner really out of that movement is the landlord that receives more rent. So although I absolutely understand the argument, and I would stamp out the bad practices, I'm not sure banning fees to tenants is quite the solution that it is, I think so, yes. And it has unintended consequences, unfortunately.
Stephen, what about the idea Labour's also talked about creating a national register of private landlords, which should, force the bad guys out? Do you think that would work? And who's going to run it? How much is it going to cost?
Well, I mean, who's to run something like that? Doesn't seem to be many bodies to step forward and put their hand up to expend money on that. But Michael's absolutely right. Small number of rogues have brought the industry into disrepute. I would say that the reason that Shelter and others and Citizens Advice bring forward these proposals is because the industry hasn't actually set its own house in order, and it's a bit of a disappointment to have to say that, and apologies to our hosts this evening, but estate agents by and large and lettings agents haven't actually driven the rogues out. I've had two sons through university, one currently at university. They have been subject to the rip-off fees, unexplained charges late in the day for properties that they want. And when I know how much the cost of, for example, a tenant's referencing actually costs compared to the charge that a lettings agents in the back street of Cardiff may charge, you see that there is money being made nefariously, I would say. So something needs to be done about it. A register would help. I would still worry that there'd be, if you like, a shadow market of people who don't go anywhere near those and who would still end up with some of those horror show houses in multiple occupation that you see scattered across London and most of our major cities at the moment.
They was also talking about 3-year tenancies,
that's
a ceiling, or what they call, but don't actually detail, excessive rent rises.
Personally, I think both of those things are a good idea. Nationwide, probably the most enlightened building society allows buy-to-let landlords to have 3-year assured tenancies. Whereas many people say there's no demand for them. There's no demand because people know that they're generally not available at the moment. We would say that if you want people to build communities in the rented sector, you've got to allow them to stay in there longer than 6 months.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Steve said. He's absolutely right. The mortgage works will allow 3-year tenancy, and it's popular for those people that want it because it gives them security.
Yeah. And I think it helps.
I can tell you that the popularity of longer-term lets is definitely becoming more common. So they are tending to extend out from 12 months to 2 years to 3 years, and this is often because of schooling for children and people wanting to have more stability.
Anyway,
yes, I don't think probably the politicians need to interfere. Actually,
no, I think the average tenancy is somewhere between 3 and 4 years anyway across the UK. So,
but you are the only lender, major high street lender, that will allow a 3-year tenancy at the moment. Other lenders need to follow your lead on that.
Absolutely.
I would say.
Okay, we're cracking. Time is rolling on. We've got a couple more questions I want to get to. This one is, what is the best way of raising tax revenue through property? You all know that chancellors have traditionally looked at the housing market, whether it's stamp duty or what have you, council tax and what have you. I want to begin with you, Tom. Let's the non-doms and the mansion tax, all that stuff. Let's talk to the rich guys first. Is it true that they're all going to go, you know what, I'm going back to Switzerland or Monaco and what have you, are they just going to hand over the cash because it's so great living in London?
I think there won't be as many leaving as they think there will be, but there won't be where the government makes its money on the non-doms is, okay, they're not paying much income tax in the UK, but if they're buying a nice property in Belgravia for £20 million, that's a lot of stamp duty. So I think a lot of the non-doms will be staying here.
But these new rates we're talking about at the top end, sort of £35,000 in effect, council tax, let's call it that. I mean, is that going to have any impact whatsoever? We've got this great trickle-down theory that it all starts in London and works its way through.
That's right. Well, just to step back, a little bit of a technical guide. The reason why you need the tax on properties is that they're often owned by companies offshore. And the reason for that is to save inheritance tax. So if you're saving inheritance tax on a £20 million property, maybe £35,000 a year is the price you're willing to pay for it. So it's a bit of a sort of swings and roundabouts.
Well, I suppose what we need, we haven't had for many a year, is a look at council tax banding, but I guess most politicians are pretty scared because the ultimate result of that would be we'd all pay more, right?
That's right, which is probably why they're probably going to rebrand it slightly as a mansion tax and start with the more expensive properties and then work their way down to cheaper properties over time.
What's your view on that?
Well, I think the mansion tax is just a non-discussion item, really. It's window dressing. I think that it's going to affect 97,000 houses in the United Kingdom, which is a tiny number. I think there will be quite a lot of heat and emotion around those that are valued around about the 2 million mark. I can see quite a lot of people appealing against that. The payment at 2 million is going to be only 3,000 a year, so it's not a huge amount of money, but it rises very steeply when you start talking about tens and 20 millions. So I think it will have quite a big impact in some of the wealthiest parts. What I would say broadly is that the property industry is already heavily taxed. It is massively taxed, and so I think when politicians talk about more tax, I think, again, there's a certain amount of window dressing going on here.
Do people still look at council tax? Is that still, given the property inflation we've had, is which band you're in? Is that important these days?
I mean, when you buy a house, yes, it matters to everybody. But the fact is that I think that if you're shopping in that price band, you know full well how much you're going to pay, and you've priced that into the budget. I just agree that at some stage politicians are going to have to revalue the properties in every band, and that's probably the huge political issue, really.
I think one of the interesting things about the market last year, when central London was viewed as overheating, was that trying to control the market through mortgage lending rules showed that it was ineffective. In central London, something like 60 to 70% of properties were being bought by cash buyers and overseas nationals. And so whatever you do in terms of mortgage rules doesn't impact that. I would be interested in circumstances like that to impose the sort of thing they have in Australia or indeed in Hong Kong, to actually have different tiers of stamp duty for non-British nationals buying property. And that could have taken the heat out, but a big bold step for any politician to make.
Again, lots of nodding heads here. Actually, we've mentioned London, and in some ways I wanted to avoid it, but actually you can't really, because in many ways everything we're talking about tonight and the whole politics of this is born out of what happened in London and how it has gone out. I mean, just how much of a freak show is that London property market, and how much better off and sensible would life be if we didn't have that southeast bull? And I guess there's absolutely nothing we can do about it.
The really scary thing is that the politicians live in London, the media, with respect, live in London, that the senior managers of the bankers and everybody else live in London, and they view the London market as the UK market, and it's not. It's very important, but if you make policy based on London, I think you distort the whole of the UK.
I mean, when people talk about house prices, so often they're really talking about what happens in a handful of postcodes in central London. If you talk to people who live in many parts of northeast Britain, there are loads of houses that aren't selling, and house prices are not rising. Same for places like North Wales. So I think that what the London market does is distort the discussion about house prices and loan to values and everything else. So I think it's unhelpful in that way.
What would happen in the housing associations in London if the Tories got in and went ahead with their plans? Presumably there would be a huge impact.
It would be a massive impact, yeah. I mean, the amount of right to buy would be huge. It would be a big loss.
What impact could the increase in government spending or changes in interest or inflation rates have on mortgage rates and the availability of housing stock? I suppose what we're saying is, as traditionally the barometer of the feel-good factor was always associated with housing, how does that big feel-good, the economy's ticking over factor, interest rates likely, as we were saying, to remain low for some time, is there really going to be a huge change depending on who gets in, either individually or as part of a coalition? Is it going to be a very different market, private sector, rental, post 2 weeks' time than it is today, Michael?
I mean, the obvious answer is no, not that quickly. No one is going to change policies that quickly. I think we've already touched on some of the more subtle changes. Taxation clearly has an important part to play. Interest rates is a really interesting one. My own personal view is that I think interest rates are going to rise sooner than people expect. My guess is that possibly sometime next year they'll begin to rise. In the past, they tend to rise faster than they come down, so they'll probably go up in 0.5% and come down in 0.25%, and my guess is they'll go up pretty quickly by two 0.5% steps. What we have to bear in mind is if you're only paying a mortgage rate of 1.92%, an increase of 1% is actually, in percentage terms, quite a big increase in people's budgets. So I do believe rising interest rates is something that should be taken into account. I know the lenders do stress test buyers now as to whether they can afford it, and I think that will hit confidence if rates start rising.
Andy, I'm just thinking, I think all of us here are of the generation. I remember 15%, yes, with that. Younger ones here, 15% interest rate. Yep, that's what we were paying at one stage. Those, because everything is so low, if we get that 0.25 point and 0.5 point rise as early as next year, as Michael seems to be saying, that's going to have an extraordinary impact, isn't it? People are going to think, whoa, that is instantly going to drag huge amounts of cash out of people's pocket in a way that a generation hasn't seen.
I mean, I trust basically that the lenders have, within, when granting mortgages, have stress tested applicants to take into consideration a 1 or 2% increase. In fact, should be more like 3%. We mustn't forget also that actually we're assuming that wage inflation is nil. So, small rates of increase, I think, could actually be taken on board. It's how quickly these rates occur and how much by. That's the worrying factor for me. And currently, I can't see anything in the economy that says actually the rate's going to go up quickly and by large amounts.
Fixed rates weren't a feature in the market back in the time that you mentioned of 17% interest rates. Most mortgage rates were variable back in those days. These days, we've been selling maybe 90% of the mortgages that we've been doing, Andrew's been doing with us and so on a fixed rate. So I don't think there'll be an immediate impact because most mortgage borrowers currently have fixed rates. So there will be a slightly sort of dampened impact when interest rates start to rise. But we would say, without it sounding too much like an advert, this is a really good time to remortgage, to secure your family's budgeting and get a good fixed rate.
Well, it's very nearly the end of this live streaming and whole debate, and you've finally got a little plug in the hand, so you're restrained. And clearly somebody's got money out of their pocket because we've lost the light, so we need to put some more money in one of the meters. Tom, your view on where interest rates are going and the impact that's going to have on the private sector, on buy-to-let, rentals?
We're so used to low interest rates. It's going to be a bit of a shock when they start to go up for a lot of people, because a lot of people got into the housing market and interest rates would have been going down or have stayed low. So going up to 3 or 4%, 5% is going to be a bit of a shock to them and the amount of money they have available to spend.
Gentlemen, I'm going to give you a wish list, and in sort of 20 to 30 seconds each of you, if you could, on the morning after the election, say to whoever's Chancellor, here's what you need to do, mate or lady, to make housing affordable, to make everybody comfortable and give everybody a chance, get the houses we need at the price we can afford. Here's what you need to do now. What would you say, Michael?
Just maintain stability, maintain confidence in the economy, don't do anything which is going to damage the economy, and don't increase interest rates too quickly or too far.
Stephen?
Create a national forum in which, say, a 10 or 15-year housing policy can be agreed and take it out of the hands of politicians.
Well, that's an ambitious one. Tom?
Well, I have to agree with that because it seems to work pretty well with interest rates and the Bank of England. So why not try it with housing as well?
Yeah. Andy?
And I would add to that by saying build more houses.
That's a simple one.
A national plan to build significantly more housing and make up for the woeful numbers that we've built over the last 10 years.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your input over the last 45 minutes, and a particular thank you to you in the audience, live here in Keynsham, which to a certain generation is spelt Keynsham. To a younger generation, you won't know what I'm talking about, but that doesn't matter. Thank you as well to Andrews for hosting this event, and for all of you who are watching online, thank you and good evening